So I'm Chris Reidy. I'm a Professor of Sustainability Transformations at the Institute for Sustainable Futures at University of Technology, Sydney. And yes, about, it was a little over a year ago, I think, I did a webinar for NINA that Michelle invited me to do about narratives. And I've been working on narratives for, I guess, 3 or 4 years now. It's been a big focus in my research, and I take a very action research approach. Our institute has a mission to create change towards sustainable futures. So we're out there trying to make the world a better place rather than just study it. And I've been working with an international network called the SDG Transformations Forum since 2017. And one of the focuses of that forum is on transforming narratives alongside many other issues that are problematic, like governance systems and finance systems and so on. And so I've been doing a lot of research around how do narratives change? What are the narratives that are dominant at the moment? What are some other possible, the reason I'm stumbling there is because I'm letting a couple of people in by the waiting room, so apologies. So what are the dominant narratives? How do narratives change and transform? And what might be the shape of the next narrative that is emerging to hopefully replace neoliberal capitalism? So neoliberal capitalism is the label that I give to the dominant economic narrative at the moment. And you can see some of what that narrative contains. It's about achieving endless growth in GDP, even though that's impossible. It's a very individualistic narrative. It stresses competition with each other rather than collaboration or cooperation. It's about freedom and tends to express that in terms of free markets and free trade. It's about small government getting out of the way so that markets can do their thing. It's about private ownership of the, trying to enclose the commons and own it privately. It stresses separation from each other and from nature, and as a result of that, it sees nature as a commodity, something that we can exploit to our heart's content. And what we end up with as a result of that narrative of neoliberal capitalism is destruction of nature, the kind of things that we've seen with climate change, the bushfires, bleaching of coral reefs, all the impacts that we're very aware of, but also creating social injustice that's starting to simmer into conflict. And the image on the bottom left is from the protests in Santiago, Chile last year, which I was caught up in because the Transformations 2019 conference was there, and the protest kicked off just as that conference was finishing. So we had a very real experience of what transformation can look like in practice, and that it's often messy and violent and problematic. But the tensions that lead to this kind of protest have been created by the social injustice that neoliberal capitalism creates. And of course, a loss of meaning, a sense that sorry, I was just letting somebody else into the meeting room and lost my train of thought again. But the bottom right image is this sense that even though we're growing and growing and growing as an economy, we're not getting happier. We're not finding more meaning in life. We're not getting genuine human well-being from this narrative. And the thing to remember is that neoliberal capitalism is only about as old as the average life expectancy of a human right now. It started, the ideas that led to neoliberal capitalism came together in Switzerland in 1947 at the first meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society. Some of the members photographed there during that meeting on a little excursion. A bunch of scholars, mainly economists, that really embarked on the strategy to make neoliberalism dominant. And they very successfully worked to get these ideas into business schools and into government and into public discourse. And that narrative has become dominant. It was dominant by the 1980s, but the fact that they were able to engage in this transformation of a narrative shows us, firstly, that dominant narratives can transform. Secondly, humans can play an active role in that transformation if we take some strategic collective action in the direction of a narrative that we desire. Narratives can transform pretty quickly. It was only sort of 30 years from when those ideas were first discussed around the table in Switzerland that they were dominant across the economies of around the world. And that critiquing existing narratives like neoliberalism is really important, but also important is laying out an alternative. And so that leads me to ask questions about what's emerging as the next economic narrative and how can we act collectively to make sure that that next narrative has positive outcomes for people and planet. I'm just going to do one quick pause to make sure I've let everyone in who wants to be here. Looks like I have. All right. So, two things that I've done in the last year or so to try and get a sense of a response to that question about what might be the content of a next economic narrative is one's a more sort of academic approach, well, both are a bit academic, but the first one was a review of emerging narratives, particularly in the scholarly literature. And while it was looking at the scholarly literature, you can see the kind of narrative organizations that are expressing narratives that are covered in that. So looked at things like donut economics from Kate Raworth, looked at what the Sustainable Development Goals are saying, what we're hearing in the transformations community that's grown out of the series of transformation conferences. We looked at degrowth, what's the Wellbeing Economy Alliance's narrative, what's the Earth Charter's narrative, what is transmodernism, which is a kind of, is a bit more of an academic idea, but it's this more sort of integrative narrative that tries to bring different narratives together. The sort of funky sci-fi looking image is representing solar punk. So I looked at some of the literary narratives that are emerging. And down on the bottom right is Buen Vivir, the Latin American idea of good living that's emerged as well. So those are just some of the narratives that I looked at. And just to give a sense of a couple of those, donut economics, I'm sure everyone's very familiar now with the general idea of that, but what they've started doing, what Kate Raworth and others have been doing with that is bringing it down to a city scale and starting to think about what does that look like at a city scale. And so in doing that, they've said, well, we need to think about the social and the ecological aspects of the donut, which is the sort of outer boundary and the inner foundation, but also think about this globally and locally. And that leads to a series of questions and around these four quadrants. And so some of the things that you can see there, some of the kind of things that are coming out in the narrative, this first question about what, about the local and the social, what would it mean for the people of Amsterdam to thrive? So this idea of thriving is pretty common across the narratives I looked at. What would it mean for Amsterdam to thrive within its natural habitat? So this idea of people in nature rather than people separated from nature. What would it mean for Amsterdam to respect the health of the whole planet? Ideas of respect and dignity were pretty common across the narratives as well. And ideas of planetary health, that we need to look after the health of the whole planet, and that supports our own health. And then finally, what would it mean for Amsterdam to respect the well-being of people worldwide? And this idea of well-being for all around the world is another really common aspect in these emerging narratives. Another one is the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, and I was involved in some work last year that we all did to think about their messaging and what were the key elements of their narrative that they wanted to promote. And these were it was a very quick and dirty piece of work, I have to say, and I don't know if they entirely work, but the ideas are things that are generally popping up a lot across other narratives as well. So dignity, everyone having enough to live in comfort, safety and happiness, a restored and safe natural world for all life, sense of belonging, institutions that serve the common good, fairness, justice, reducing gap between rich and poor, and participation, which is interesting in light of the conversation this morning about democracy and what democracy actually means or should mean, and participation rather than voting perhaps being, and representation perhaps being what we should be aiming for in the next economic narrative. So I looked at all these different narratives and looked for the kind of elements that were coming up as common across all of them. And before I get into that, I want to share this other piece of work which contributes to this as well, which was, we did a story and we did a survey about stories. My co-author for this was Sandra Waddick at Boston College. And we put together a survey on asking people about news stories for a sustainable future. What we asked them was these questions. What do you think are the most important ideas that should be part of the stories that guide humanity into the future? What would be the characters in these stories? Can you come up with a story yourself that includes those ideas and characters? It was a pretty big ask for someone to do in a survey, is to actually write a story, but we had a lot of people have a go at that, and some of them in quite a bit of detail. What do you think are the best ways to share this story so that lots of people could be influenced? And a few demographic details just to see if there were any variations in the stories that people are telling based on those categories. And we sent it out to people involved in the SDG Transformations Forum that I talked about earlier, particularly the Transforming Narratives Network under that forum. We sent it out through WEAL's lists, promoted it at the Transformations 2019 conference and through some blog posts and social networks and so on. Sent it around my institute, various of Sandra's networks that are particularly in sort of management and business circles, a values-based schools network in the UK, and then a bit of snowballing went on as well. We asked people to share it more broadly. And adding that material to the review that I did, the kind of concepts that are coming out as common across what people told us in the survey and what people are saying in a lot of those emerging narrative initiatives that I listed out on the earlier slide, is these kind of ideas, that a different way, firstly, of looking at the world. So if neoliberal capitalism is very much about hierarchies and about separation, the next narrative proposals are about thinking of the world as complex nested systems within systems, like Russian dolls. Thinking of the world as networks, that we're connected to each other, that we're part of a web of life, that we're you pull a thread and it's connected to everything else. And the idea of cycles, that thinking of things like the circular economy, the cycles that exist in nature. So more circular than linear ideas emerging in these narratives. So that's a fundamentally different way of looking at the world to what we see in neoliberal capitalism. And it leads to a whole bunch of different ideas about our relationship to each other and our relationship to the planet. So firstly, in terms of the relationships with people and planet, really stressing human connectedness rather than the competition that is so integral to neoliberal capitalism. Arguing that we're all in this together, that it's about cooperation and being compassionate for each other, that we are part of a commons, if you like. And then a very different relationship, not just with each other, but with the planet, a relationship that's sustainable at the very least. But most of these next economic narratives or proposals for such narratives are not saying that sustainability is the goal necessarily. It's kind of a minimum standard, if you like, and we need to go further, because sustainability just means continuing to exist. And yes, of course we want that, but it's not that exciting, and a lot of damage has been done. And so continuing to exist in the way that the world is now is not enough. We need to regenerate, we need to restore. And so the relationship with the planet needs to be a regenerative and restorative one for quite some time to get back to the diversity of nature that we might aspire to. And of course, that's going to require a harmonious relationship with nature, where we don't see nature as just a resource to exploit, something separate from us, but something that we're part of, connected to, feel excited about, enjoy being involved with. So there's a lot in these narratives about what next economies might be aiming to deliver. And I'm sure in this group that none of this will be unfamiliar, but instead of the goals of growing the economy, growing GDP, we're looking for an economy that delivers genuine human well-being and thriving. Letting another person in. It's an economy that delivers social justice, that importantly delivers plurality. So it's not about any one way. And there's really interesting narratives coming out of, particularly out of Latin America, that are heavily critical of our Western narratives and what they describe as the one world that wants to make everything the same. And that it's really important that we maintain plurality of the way that people see the world, the way that they understand the world, the way that they live in the world. And the new economy needs to deliver dignity and respect for all. Then there's a lot less agreement. There's quite a bit of agreement on, those aspects about the vision, if you like, of where we want to get to. There's a lot less agreement on how to get there. But what you do see very commonly is the four things down the bottom, that some form of participatory practices, that we the citizens need to be involved in the process of transformation towards a next economy, that it needs to be a commoning process, not led by governments, because we don't have a lot of faith in that happening, not led by business, but led by civil society working together. That getting there is going to need humans to develop a lot more wisdom and awareness than we have at the moment. And so that points towards human development, capacity building, working so that people can grow their potential. And a lot of agreement also that artistic and creative practice needs to be part of this transformation, that art will be both a driver and a reflection of the kind of narratives that emerge, whether it's storytelling, it's visual arts, but just the, thinking of the human well-being and thriving, that everybody has an opportunity to engage in creativity and to make that part of their way of life. So what I'm starting to think about now, and what I would really like the people to join me with in the NINA Narratives Hub, is what might an Australian narrative look like that encompasses these elements. And of course it has to, and we heard a lot about this in the first session this morning, it must first and foremost be built on the stories of the Aboriginal people that have, during their long stewardship of this land, generated an understanding of how to live in harmony with this place. And Mary Graham's discussion this morning of autonomy, balance, law and place. I mean, those are things that we can think about. How do we make that part of our next economic narrative? It must, I think, connect us also with our unique place, our glorious Australian landscapes, as represented on the top right there. But it's also not, I'm not advocating something that's backward looking. It needs to look forward, inspire, imagine ways that regenerative technologies can be integrated into our daily lives and cities. Hence the kind of sci-fi little image on the bottom left there, but you can see nature is really integrated into that image as well. And it's got to be a narrative that always stresses that we're entangled, we're in this together, we're engaging in a process of commoning. So those are some initial ideas. I really want to explore these more in the NINA Narratives Hub, and hope that some of you might be interested in joining us in that hub. I'll have an update about that on Sunday. So please feel free to join us in that, but I'll leave it there.